humans have recorded and stored information throughout history in a variety of ways. Beginning with etchings on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, key information was maintained and kept in temples and early or elaborate libraries. Later, information was written on sheets of parchment or paper, stacked and bound into books. The advent of the printing press meant the transition from handwritten manuscripts to mass-produced books. With the invention of the typewriter in the late 1800s, millions of people could now craft and produce their own documents. About the same time, the vertical filing cabinet was invented, providing a way to efficiently organize and store all of this documentation. As copy machines and carbon paper became more and more widespread, and as government regulations required everything to be crafted in triplicate, these humble metal boxes were the mainstay of data storage throughout most of the 20th century. As computers evolved, information began to be stored digitally, first as tape and floppy drives, then as CDs and thumb drives. Suddenly, the information normally found in roomfuls of vertical filing cabinets could be contained in a single server room or even in cloud storage. Unfortunately, we traded in the quiet of a library for a much noisier environment.
These are a far cry from the peace and quiet of your local library.
Recently, scientists have begun exploring storing data within the chemical rungs of DNA. Over 1 billion bits of information can be encoded in a DNA molecule the size of a speck of dust. Provided it's kept cool and dry, the DNA is stable for thousands of years. And when you're ready to retrieve it, you just sequence and interpret. In this session, we'll explore DNA-based data storage, its limitations and its possibilities. And we'll imagine a world where a lifetime of tax returns or your entire collection of Pinterest boards can be stored in a tiny plastic vial.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears from criminology and talk about how we store data. Now, I'm willing to bet that all of you have some place in your home where you have a whole bunch of stuff, probably in paper, crammed into a file cabinet somewhere. Yeah? Mine is actually in the attic. And I'm also willing to bet that many of you probably have a whole drawer of digital things like floppies and thumb drives and maybe zip drives if you really kind of bought into that concept. And if you're like me, there's a place where I have like 15 thumb drives and I never know what's on them. And when I'm looking for one, I'm like, oh no, I can't delete that, that's important. Oh wait, that's prom from like 6 years ago. Oh wait, no, that's baby pictures. Yeah, so I have a collection of digital imagery just like I have a filing cabinet full of pieces of paper as well. The digital age began the moment, I love this quote, when we outsourced memory to a machine, when we asked a machine to begin to do things that we traditionally had done ourselves. Before we dig into that though, let's get some language. Let's get some wording. Let's talk about bytes and kilobytes and petabytes and all those pieces. So a kilobyte is about a little more than 1,000 bytes. A byte is 8 bits, just a measurement of storage. A kilobyte is about the equivalent of storing 2 to 3 paragraphs of text. So if you are in Microsoft Word or Google Document and you type in 2 or 3 paragraphs of text, that is the equivalent of about a kilobyte of digital data. Now let's go up an order of magnitude to a megabyte. A megabyte is a little more than 1,000 kilobytes. That's the equivalent of about a minute of your favorite song on an MP3 player. So, on an iPod Nano or on your phone, your favorite song, let's say that it's maybe 4 minutes long, a minute of that is 1,000,000 bytes, 1,000 kilobytes of data. So your favorite song, a 4-minute song, 4 megabytes. Let's come up in order of magnitude to a gigabyte. So a gigabyte is about 900,000 pages of text or about 350 digital photos, depending on the resolution of your digital camera. Your phone is probably now measures the amount of storage in gigabytes. So it's a 16 or a 64 or 128 gigabyte phone, which gives you a sense of the amount of storage. Let's go up one more. A terabyte. So a terabyte is about 916 million pages of text, about 20 Blu-ray discs. So 20 of your favorite 3-hour movies on Blu-ray, 20 of those, all the information on those, that's about a terabyte of data. Many of our computers now come with terabyte storage. The Xbox One ships, I think, with like a terabyte drive in it. Okay, let's go bump up to a petabyte. A petabyte, I like this, the equivalent of 20 million 4-drawer filing cabinets. That is a lot of data, a lot. And then we can go up again to an exabyte, and even further to a zettabyte. Okay, so we're talking big data. And in our world, where we are storing more and more data, whether it's storing all the information from our health records, whether it's storing all of the astronomy information as the telescopes search the skies, or whether it's everything from Facebook and Pinterest. Lots and lots of data are being produced that all have to be stored somewhere. I asked Peyton McNully, who is in charge of all of our data informatics storage issues at the Institute, for some facts about how much data we use at the Institute, given all of our sequencing machines and all the computational analysis. And he told me that we produce 60 terabytes of data every week. So every week, our analysis machines are generating 60 terabytes of data, and that we have 20 petabytes of hard storage, of hard drives. Now, there are all sorts of issues about what happens when you fill those and how do you then move those to things that are called like cold storage, where it is cheaper to store but you access it less. And so there's this balance all the way across of how much storage do I need to have access to immediately because I need to be able to pull out data and analyze it, versus I don't really need this right now. I may come back to it in a year, so I'm going to put it into what's called cold storage. Less access, but probably cheaper. Here's the evolution of the way we've stored data. We first started with punch cards in the 1880s, and they showed their worth in the analysis of the 1890 US Census. That's really what turned the corner for punch cards. Now, I don't think anybody in this room was using punch cards in the 1880s, but I know some of you actually probably were using punch cards in the early computers in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And you had to feed a whole stack of punch cards. Yeah, many of you are like, oh yeah, I know those punch cards, yeah. Yeah, and the younger people in our audience are going, punch cards? What are punch cards? Yeah. Yeah. The history of the digital world all in one room. Okay, so then in the 50s, magnetic tape was developed, and magnetic tape was originally used to record audio, but people realized it was a great media for storing data. And we actually still store data on magnetic tape, especially if we're looking for long-term storage. And then cassettes and floppies, and we first started floppies. When we got our first computer, the floppies were, big and they were floppy. And then we moved to the smaller sized floppies, and then CDs, and first CDs that you could read, and then CDs that you could actually write onto as well. And then we jump all the way up to the 1990s to zip drives. I don't know if anybody remembers zip drives. They were thick and they were big. I worked in a communications world at that point, and zip drives were the way you stored information. And I have a whole box full of zip drives at home that I don't even think I have a zip reader, so I am never going to get those pictures off that. Which is exactly what the problem of data storage is, isn't it? Because we continually change the technology, and you've got stuff on older tools, older platforms that you may or may not be able to get back out. And then we moved to SD cards, and then USB flash drives, thumb drives. And if you're like me, you've got a drawer of thumb drives. And then in the mid-2010s, the cloud. And the magical place where data is just stored somewhere in the cloud, the concept of the cloud. So we've pretty dramatically changed the way we store information as we've needed to store more and more of it and access it faster and faster. Here are the challenges with that. Every 5 years, the amount of data that we produce increases tenfold. And over the last 2 years, we created more data than in all of preceding history. Let's just think about that for a second. In all of preceding history. So students that are in the room or that are hearing this, you go back to your world history textbook and you go back to the very beginning, like page 5, all the data that was created up until the end of your book, we've created more of that data in the last 2 years. That's mind-boggling, amazing, incredible, a little scary as well, all of this kind of information. By the year 2040, we will have generated 3,000 zettabytes of data. Now, let's just get a sense of what a zettabyte, how much 3,000 zettabytes is. Those of you that like to binge watch Netflix, it would take you 50 billion years of watching Netflix to get to this number. That's a lot of couch time. That's a lot. That's like you've watched it so much that you've like grown into your sofa. Yeah, 50 billion years. And the capacity of our existing storage, our silicon-based our silica-based storage isn't able to keep up. So we are going to very quickly produce more data than we have the capacity to store it. So that's driven people to look for new ways to try to think about how we store data, which brings us to this amazing DNA molecule. There are lots of advantages to DNA as a potential storage mechanism. It already is a storage mechanism. It stores information inside every single living cell, accesses that information when it needs it, and faithfully replicates it onto the next generation. So it is your ultimate biological storage tool. If you look at all of the cells in the human body, and you look at all of the DNA, one human is carrying 150 zettabytes of data. 150 zettabytes of data in all of the cells in your body. So we already have an amazing storage tool. It's tiny. It does not take up a lot of room. And you can store a lot of information in a small space. You don't have to have server rooms that you spend huge amounts of money to keep cool. So there's not a big power issue. You just dry it down and you put it in a freezer. And it lasts tens of thousands of years. We sequence DNA from woolly mammoths that have been stored in permafrost for tens of thousands of years. We could store data in DNA and come back to it tens of thousands of years later. As long as we as a society are still using DNA biologically, we are going to be interested in being able to encode and read it. So it isn't one of those things where we're going to say, wow, does anybody have a DNA sequencer? I don't know how to store my DNA. I don't know how to read this DNA I stored 20,000 years ago, because we're always going to be analyzing our DNA. So here's how this process works. So those of you that have been in any of our biotechs before know that I have a particular fondness for Charles Dickens. So here is David Copperfield, and here are the opening lines of David Copperfield. We're going to focus specifically on the opening sentence, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. Let's imagine we're going to take this information and we're going to store it now as DNA. How would we go about that process? Now, there are lots of ways this could be done. I'm going to show you a straightforward one just to give you an example. So let's take the first word. The letters are converted into a binary code that consists of ones and zeros. And I specifically used an ASCII code. There's a website that you can go to where you type in your text and it gives you the 1 and 0 equivalent for each one of the letters. So here's our first word, whether. And here the zeros and ones, that's the binary equivalent. That string of zeros and ones is the equivalent of the word whether. Then I convert that into the DNA letters, the A's, T's, C's, and G's. In this particular example, I've said that I'm going to work with 2 digits at a time. Every 0, 1, for example, is a T. So 0, 1, there's a T. There's another 0, 1, that's another T. Here's another 0, 1, that's a T. Every 1, 1 is going to be a G. Every 1, 0 is a C, and every 0, 0 is an A. So I've just built my own conversion platform. And I've said, okay, I'm going to take all these zeros and ones, and I'm just going to convert them into a string of A's, T's, C's, and G's. Everybody with me? All right. Now I'm going to go to a machine called a DNA synthesizer. And this DNA synthesizer, I enter into a computer. I need the synthesizer to build this string of DNA. It might be 200 letters long. It might be 2,000 letters long. It might be 20,000 letters long. And it will actually assemble the chemicals of DNA, A, T, C, and G, in whatever order I've asked it, to build this string of DNA. Now, I've actually done something additionally. So it's built my string of DNA that's associated with the word weather, but I've also put these tags on the end that I'm going to call address locators. And those address locators essentially say, this is where this piece of information fits in my overall document. This is the first word of the first page of the book. So the address locator makes it easy when I am reading it back on the other end to know where it fits in the overall piece. And so I've now essentially taken this first sentence, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, etc., and I've broken it into small strings of DNA, and I've overlapped them. So in this case, I kind of shifted them over every 25 nucleotides, which gives me some built-in redundancy so that I can go back and I've covered every piece of DNA multiple times along with these locators. So I've now used my DNA synthesizer, and I've built all of these pieces of DNA, each individual piece encoding the equivalent of a set of letters from the first line of Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. And then because those are made in a water-based solution, I dehydrate them, and I actually store them frozen. And I get this little tiny smear that you can barely kind of see, this pink smear. And I have millions of bits of information in that little smear of DNA. Now I can do this not only for text, I can do this with pictures. I can take every picture and I can break it down pixel by pixel, and I can assign a value for the color of that pixel and its location in the overall picture. I can do that for music. I can break the music down. Anytime you stream music, you've already broken it down into a digital code, and then you're just and then you have to reinterpret it when you play it back. But I can do this for anything that I want to store. I can create a piece of DNA that I have built a code that tells me, all right, these A's, T's, C's, and G's, they stand for this bit of information. Everybody with me on that? It's kind of stunning and kind of elegantly beautiful to think that we take our own pattern, our own code of information, and we're using our DNA code to then store all types of other bits of information. So when I need the information, I take my tube of dried out DNA, I rehydrate it, I add water to it, and then I take the fragments and I put them in a DNA sequencer, the same kind of DNA sequencers that we have over at the Institute that we use to sequence human DNA or plant DNA. I'm just now sequencing all these little fragments that I've artificially created. And I sequence them out, and the computer says, okay, this fragment is ATCC, GGAA, TTCC, etc. And this fragment is a different ATC combination. And I put them into a computer, and then I tell the computer, this is the code I need you to use now to flip it back from A's, T's, C's, and G's to zeros and ones, and then from the zeros and ones back down to my set of letters. So I've just worked my way backwards through that process. So here it is on a single slide. My text, zeros and ones. I synthesize the DNA, I store it, I rehydrate it and sequence it back to zeros and ones, and then I convert it back to my text. That's the process of how information can be stored in DNA. So people have been talking about this since the late 1970s as a possibility. But it really wasn't until about 6 years ago that scientists actually did it. And at that point in time, they used DNA for the very first time to store digital data, just kind of as a proof of concept. People went, wait, this is real. We can actually do this, and we can get the data out without lots and lots of errors. Let's figure out, let's figure out how we now move this forward. So in 2016, a whole team of scientists and computer application specialists and computer programmers, they now hold the record, and right now it's not a very big record, admittedly, but 2 megabytes of data stored in 72,000 strands of DNA. That is a lot of DNA strands because there's a lot of redundancy built in. Every bit of information is stored in multiple places because that reduces the likelihood that you lose data because I've stored it in multiple places. Last year, a technique was developed for storing 215 petabytes per gram of DNA. 215 petabytes. Let me take you back to the petabyte, the amount of data in a petabyte per gram. This is an 8 terabyte hard drive. All right? 8 terabyte. A sugar cube size DNA could store 1,000 times more data than our current largest facility. A sugar cube's worth of DNA, I told you this is 8 terabytes. A sugar cube's worth of DNA, 10,000 terabytes. So 8, 10,000. In fact, this next number just kind of blows my mind. It's estimated that all of the data could be stored in DNA in containers roughly the size of 2 pickup trucks. All of the world's DNA, all the information that's been produced to date, if we were to convert it in DNA and freeze it down, it would occupy the cubic space of 2 pickup trucks. Now, the Jackson Center wasn't really thrilled when I asked if we could drive some pickup trucks into here tonight. So I'm just going to have to use the visual up here. But what I want you to realize, again, this technology is in its infancy, truly in its infancy. But if it does what we think it will be able to do, that is huge. That is the way we potentially think about storing all of the information. Now, there are some challenges with it. Now, on your handout, I have flipped these 2 points. I apologize. You're going to need to flip them back. I think I had this as the cost of reading. The cost of writing, the cost of synthesizing the DNA. In the 1970s, it was $600 per letter. It's cheaper today. It's about 10 cents per letter. But when you're talking about sequencing billions of bits of information, 10 cents per letter is still prohibitively expensive. We need to drop this by probably 5 magnitudes of cost to get it down to where it is realistic to think about really using DNA as a storage tool. So we've got to figure out ways to make synthesizing the DNA much, much cheaper. It is also still relatively expensive to sequence the DNA, to read it back out. But if you've been in any of our classes, and you wouldn't be here if you hadn't been, you know that the cost to sequence DNA is dropping exponentially year after year after year. So it continues to get cheaper to read it back out once I've put it in storage. The speed of storage right now is a real problem. It takes We can read, I can synthesize in hundreds of bytes per minute. Your computer reads in hundreds of millions of bytes per minute. At our current speed, it would take hours to store a photo off your phone. Hours. So we still have a lot of work to do in increasing the speed at which we're able to write, synthesize the information. And there are some issues with errors. So biologically, this is a biological process, synthesizing and sequencing, and it has some struggles with certain types of sequence. So we have to think about how we minimize our issues with data loss and with data corruption. And then how do I randomly access the data? So right now, when you are looking at your phone and you want to look at a picture, you scroll through your pictures and you say, that's the one I want. When you are on your computer and you're looking for a file, you say, that's the file I want. You don't have to read through every single word of every file to find the section you're interested in. Right now, we're still working on how you can randomly access the information that you want when things are stored in DNA. Right now, it's still, I got to sequence through the whole thing and then go back and find what I want. So how can I pull on demand what I'm interested in? What's been really cool about this whole field is that the scientists that are working on storing information in DNA have a pathway that's already been laid out for them by the people that figured out, how do I store information on a CD or on a DVD or on a music streaming system? How do I minimize errors in data loss and in data corruption? And so they're actually using the same kind of tools that people are using with digital data to figure out how to deal with issues with DNA data. And what's been really fascinating to watch is the type of collaboration that has come about between computational scientists, molecular biologists, people that know the architecture of data, unlikely partnerships to figure out how do we realistically think about storing large amounts of information in DNA. Here are some future applications if this actually turns out to work. This one, cells as living data recorders. These are all really cool. Let me back up. This is pretty cool stuff. Cells as living data recorders. There are groups of scientists that are working on figuring out how your cells could take in information about their surroundings and store that information in extra pieces of DNA inside the cells and then read that information back out. So you could imagine cells could be used to report on what's going on in the cells around them. What kind of connections are my neurons making in my hippocampus? Am I identifying early evidence of Alzheimer's? What kind of interactions are going on with the cells in my heart? And are there enough electrical impulses, or am I beginning to deal with a failing heart before I ever see the first set of symptoms? What kind of messages are being sent back and forth between the bacteria in my body and the cells that they come in contact with? This whole concept of your cells as a reporting system, really amazing and very science fiction-y at the same time. So there's an interesting group right now that's trying to figure out, using some funds from DARPA, from the Department of Defense, trying to figure out if they can actually use DNA-based storage as a way to search and recognize images. Now, I don't fully get how this works. Let me just acknowledge that. I got through about half of the paper and just kind of went, okay, yeah. Data-minded I am not. But as a proof of concept, this group, which includes folks from Microsoft and folks from Twist Bioscience and folks from and academicians, actually has just launched something called Memories in DNA. This is a website you can go to, and they are looking for 10,000 original images that people are willing to upload and say, you can encode my image in DNA, to then build a database that they can test search engine. Like Google, when you say, when you search Google Images and you say, show me something that's got 3 red cars and a stop sign, could you actually have that happen inside a DNA system? So if you have your favorite picture that you'd like recorded for all posterity in DNA, you can go to this website and you can upload the picture and it may be chosen in the overall process. Really interesting way to kind of involve the public in this. If you want to know more about this, the basic stuff is up top. Digging deeper into this, like DARPA wants to build an image search engine out of DNA, here are your references. Those of you in the crowd, and you know who you are, that really want to figure out how this works and dig into it, here are some places for you to get started. What I find fascinating about this is that this storage tool that exists inside every single one of our cells may be an answer to how we think about, as we continue to produce more and more data, how we store it and how we store it in realistic ways. Stay tuned for this. This is really, like I said, something that's not even 5 years old, the science of, and we're going to see it happen more and more and more. Now, I've run us over, and so I'm not going to take questions from the audience because I value your time and I've committed to you to stop at 8, and I'm already past that. But I'll be up here if you've got questions, if you want to dig into it, we can talk about it more. Next week, we're going to talk about how can biotechnology change my DNA, gene editing. We're going to dive into gene editing, and then does that potentially impact this whole concept that we hear a lot of hype about with designer babies? So have a good night, drive safe, and I will see you back next week. Thanks, everybody.